Hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining a new IAA Monday session, this time on a topic that unifies people around the world, which is football. And of course, football is passion, is emotion, but it's also business. And in this sense, to talk about the value of football brands, we have the privilege of having today Declan Ahern, Valuations Director of Brand Finance, that will present us how they evaluate the 50 most valuable football clubs in the world, what parameters they take into account, and how this brand valuation techniques also works to evaluate sponsorships, pricing, negotiations, and activations. Declan joined Brand Finance in 2016, being now the Valuations Director at Brand Finance PLC and a Director of Brand Finance Africa. He leads the financial services sector in the company, leading the team that produces the annual most valuable global banking brands. He also lectures at various academic institutions and business schools. Declan has extensive experience in market research, brand and business valuations, brand strategy and positioning, sponsorships evaluation, and brand architecture. Declan's clients includes ABSA, Liverpool Football Club, Access Bank, Citibank, First National Bank, and Royal Bank of Canada, among others. Declan, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And just before passing the floor on to you, just telling the audience that they can send their questions to the chat box. You can do it along his presentation because we will gather them and we'll pass it on to him at the end of his speech in the Q&A session. So feel free to do it whenever you feel. And Declan, really looking forward to listening to you. And the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. There we go. I think, can everyone see my presentation screen, hopefully? Let's just see if I can click through that it works. Awesome. Great. So I think just to start off, I'd like to introduce you to Brand Finance. Many of you may not have heard of who we are, but we are a valuation and strategy consultancy. We are headquartered in London, but we've got a global presence. We've got an office in Spain, actually, in Madrid, and various satellite offices around the world. We're a team of about 200 people. Some of you who are familiar with Brand Finance might be familiar with our brand valuation rankings. And these rankings are done on corporate brands, so brands you'll be familiar with, like Coca-Cola and Unilever, for example. And what we do is we publish these in sector tables and we publish them in country tables. And of course, the relevant table and valuations that I'm speaking about today is the world's most valuable football brands, which you might have seen on Sky Sports News or Sky News or BBC or various other media channels. Now, when most people think of a brand, I think the first thing that comes to mind is how it impacts the consumer or the customer of the brand. And of course, the brand is there to make money for the business, and it's there to be able to attract customers, to charge them a price premium, to increase market share for the business. But we at Brand Finance take the view that the customer is not the only stakeholder that is important from a branding perspective. So we've got some very good data that says because a company has a strong brand, they can attract and retain staff. So there's lower recruitment costs, better staff retention, better staff morale. Of course, there are other stakeholders like the financial audience. So things like debtors, like your bank, borrowing money from your bank, they're willing to give debt at a much more favorable rate to businesses that have highly branded organizations that have very strong brands. There's, of course, a whole range of other external audiences, things like corporate social responsibility, managing the media, managing public relations. All of these things are easier and more favorable provided that you have a strong brand in your organization. And again, just to step through some of these other stakeholders, things like corporate suppliers, for example. So because you have a stronger brand, the supplier is willing to charge you a lower price for their products and services. You get better terms, you get better partners. I've mentioned staff and financiers, but equally there are regulatory requirements for brands operating in multiple industries and governments, and you get far more favorable terms and conditions provided you are a strong brand. Another kind of justification for why brands are extremely important is the fact that stronger brands actually generate higher returns in terms of their share price on the stock market than non-strong brands. So what we have on screen here is a chart showing share price returns for the S&P 500. That is in the blue chart. In the red chart, we've got the top 10 strongest brands as evaluated by Brand Finance. And in the green, we've got the top 20 most valuable brands as a proportion of their overall business value. And you can see that the red and the green charts outperform the share price returns for the S&P 500 on an annual basis since 2015. So what this says is that stronger brands generate better returns on the stock market. Now, in order to value brands, I think it's important that we try and define what we are valuing in the first place. So when we speak about brands at Brand Finance, we are speaking about a separate intangible asset of the business. Typically, it's the logo, the trademark, the associated intellectual property around the logo and the trademark. And theoretically, this can be bought and sold by a third-party transactor. And the way we calculate the value of a brand is a four-step process. And the methodology is known as the royalty relief methodology. And it is based on a hypothetical situation where a business owner doesn't own the brand that it uses, but instead has to license the brand from a third party. Typically, that is done in the form of a royalty payment on revenue. So if we take Coca-Cola, for example, we know that Coca-Cola owns their brand and they protect their brand, and therefore they don't have to license the brand from someone else. They experience a relief from paying royalty payments, and that's where the name comes from, the royalty relief methodology. So there's a four-step process. The first is we are trying to measure the overall strength of the brand, and that is done in the form of the brand strength index. And what we use at Brand Finance is a whole range of KPIs. And in the football case, we use a whole range of KPIs from football fan research conducted globally. And what we try and do is benchmark scores for one club or one brand versus another. And we express that score out of 100. Once we've got that score out of 100, we then move on to step 2. And that is where we try and determine what someone would be willing to pay in order to license a brand. So again, Coca-Cola, say someone wanted to come and open up Coca-Cola in a new country, they'd have to come to Coca-Cola and say, listen, we would like to license the brand from you. In step 2, we are trying to determine what that appropriate percentage is to license the brand. And let's just say, again, keeping with the theme of Coca-Cola, we think in soft drinks that brands are licensed for between 0 and 10% of top line revenues. And we rate Coca-Cola as a 90 out of 100 brand. You multiply those two numbers together, and that gives you a license fee for Coca-Cola of 9%. You then take that 9% and you apply it to step 3, which is the forecasted revenues of the business. And that then gives us the forecasted brand earnings for the business in question. We then move on to step 4, and that is discounting those brand earnings to the present value using a weighted average cost of capital. It's a very typical financial technique. It's used by kind of the big four, by investment bankers, very similar to a discounted cash flow for those of you that might be familiar. And those discounted brand earnings into the present value is what we call the value of the brand, or the brand value. Now, probably a more relevant section for everyone on the call today is that of the brand strength index. So that part of the methodology where we are evaluating the overall strength or the overall perceptions of the brand in the eyes of all the stakeholders. And the index is broken down into 3 parts. So the first part is brand investment or marketing investment. So from a brand perspective, we want to see that the brand is being invested in terms of overall marketing spend, that new products and services are being developed, that you are promoting the brand appropriately on social media and on your website. And the idea here is that high investment into the brand will lead to brand equity. And brand equity is much more rooted in the perceptions of stakeholders on the brand. These are things like overall brand awareness, overall brand consideration, and overall brand recommendation. And again, the idea here is that high levels of equity into the brand will translate into better brand performance. And brand performance in this case refers to the more hard-nosed metrics, things like revenues and profits. So if we take a football club, for example, investment into the brand might be purchasing players, for example, but equally it might be sending your team on an international tour pre the start of your season to try and grow the regional footprint of, say, Manchester United or Real Madrid overseas. By investing into the brand, they would expect high levels of brand equity. So more football fans, more sponsors would be aware of the brand. They'd look at the brand more favorably. They'd like the brand more. They'd recommend the brand more. They'd be willing to pay more money, for example, to go and watch Man United or Real Madrid play football. And if you have fans and other stakeholders looking at your brand more favorably, that then leads to higher financial outcomes, better broadcasting deals, better sponsorship deals, better match day revenue too. If we unpack that a little bit further, you can see that we have some attributes and elements that make up each of these 3 pillars: brand investment, brand equity, and brand performance. As mentioned, when you're investing into the brand, you can build out better products, better services. You can try and create more traffic to your websites. You can promote the brand better through advertising, through social media, through word of mouth. And the idea here is that once you do that effectively and widespread across the globe, you'll get higher levels of brand equity among stakeholders who are looking at the brand. So you'll get higher brand awareness or familiarity, higher brand consideration, so more people would want to use your products or services, higher recommendation, more people want to recommend your products and services. And again, once you have higher scores for familiarity, for consideration, for overall brand reputation, that should translate then to higher revenues, higher market share for the brand, higher customer loyalty, for example, and higher forecasted profits. Now, I briefly mentioned the fact that we do market research to inform our brand strength index. So how market research typically works is we at Brand Finance go and create a survey, and we then conduct the survey and look for respondents to the survey in various countries around the world. For our corporate rankings, so brands in the corporate world, the likes of Coca-Cola, Ferrari, Google, Amazon, we currently do market research in 41 countries and 35 different sectors globally. And typically this research covers things that you would typically call the brand conversion funnel. It's in the middle of the screen. So brand awareness to brand familiarity to brand consideration. But equally, we look at a various range of image attributes, things like overall reputation, quality of products and services. Does the brand offer good value for money? Is the brand innovative? And all of these KPIs feed into the brand strength index that I mentioned earlier. So what we have on this slide is an example of the top 10 strongest brands in 2022 across the world. You can see that we rate the strongest brand in the world as WeChat in China. The second is Coca-Cola. The third is Google. The fourth is YouTube. And the fifth is a brand called Naver. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got what we call a brand ratings distribution. So each score out of 100 corresponds to a separate rating, where you can see that the highest rated AAA plus brands on the left-hand side of this chart corresponds to brands who score over 90 out of 100 in overall brand strength index. So it works similar to how, say, the S&P or Fitch or Moody's or any of the credit rating agencies would assign a brand rating to. And why is this applicable? Well, if you know and nurture the value of your brand, you can optimize it. You can spend appropriately, so brand value optimization. Perhaps there are areas of opportunity where the brand can enter into, both geographically and from a product and service offering. Secondly, there's insights, benchmarking, and target setting. So ideally, you want to benchmark against your competitors. You want to know that you are performing better than them in specific KPIs. You want your awareness levels to be higher, your consideration levels to be higher than your competitors. You also want to educate other stakeholders in your organization around why the value of your brand is important and why it should be invested in. Then, of course, there's investment allocation and cost control. So are you spending your marketing budgets appropriately? Is there perhaps an opportunity cost of where else you should be spending money that would be more effective? Training, guidelines, and incentive planning. So providing a platform of understanding where you can educate stakeholders within your business, educate perhaps those who are not necessarily marketing orientated within the business of why the brand should be invested in. And then, of course, you get to strategic decision making. So in the case of the football world, is it appropriate to sponsor, say, the likes of Real Madrid or Barcelona? And if you are going to sponsor them, at what levels should you pay to get an effective return on your sponsorship investment? Again, just to reiterate of why brands are so important, you can see that the value of the world's top 500 corporate brands represent $8.1 trillion. So as an asset within the business, brands are extremely, extremely, extremely valuable and therefore should be invested in and treated as often the most valuable asset in a company's balance sheet. Another interesting takeaway, I think, from this slide is that you can see we've had huge growth in overall brand value from the likes of China and the likes of the US. So you can see the United States still overwhelmingly makes up the majority of overall brand value in the light blue. But you can see the likes of China have seen huge growth since the inceptions of our rankings in 2007 to the second most valuable country in terms of brand valuations at the moment. Now, I think it's time to turn our heads towards kind of the more topic at hand, and that is the football rankings that Brand Finance produces each year. In terms of our football service, we really offer kind of two broad services in the sports space. The first is a service to rights holders, and rights holders in this case would be the clubs themselves, the football clubs or the football leagues, or the organization or governing bodies like UEFA or FIFA, for example. And what we offer to those rights holders is market research, so conducting research of why those clubs or those leagues are more favorable than their competitors, for example. We do a lot of work in sponsorship negotiation and prospecting. We also track and activate sponsorships, and we help them formalize their commercial strategy. So, where's an opportunity for the likes of Real Madrid to grow their fan base, say in China or the US, and how they should go about doing that. We also offer services to corporate companies. So these would be the likes of the sponsors of these football clubs, so corporate brands. And again, for them, we do market research. We do sponsorship evaluation. So are they getting appropriate return on their sponsorship investment? And we do sponsorship activation and strategy. So the real question then is, how does brand valuation and these rankings that you see help in sports business? Well, if we review the financials of a sporting operating company, there are three primary income sources for most teams. There's match day, there's broadcasting, and there's commercial revenue. So let's take Liverpool, for example. If we look at match day revenue, that's in the red. 18% of their income is from match day taking. So that is selling tickets for commercial match days. Season tickets, on the day match day tickets, for example. The second is broadcasting, and that's in the blue. That's typically negotiated across leagues and then distributed to each club or team. So for La Liga, for example, the governing body La Liga, they would go and negotiate broadcasting deals with the likes of BN or Sky Sports. They would then take that money and distribute it to the clubs below them, so they could reinvest in their teams, in their infrastructure, and keep that virtuous cycle going. And then finally, we have what is often the largest revenue stream, that is commercial income. That is represented in the light green on the graph here. And often this is the area where clubs can in fact grow their revenues and have the most control over their revenues. The commercial income represents sponsorship agreements, licensing of their brands, other commercial avenues. And really, this is often where most of our work at Brand Finance is done, because, of course, it's very difficult to increase your match day revenues. You'd have to go and build a bigger stadium or charge more for your tickets. It's very difficult to increase your broadcasting revenues because that is negotiated at a singular level by the governing body, so by the Premier League or by La Liga. However, the likes of Liverpool have strong control over their commercial revenues. One area that I did want to highlight before we moved on was the fact that during the COVID kind of pandemic, obviously match day revenues were severely impacted. So Liverpool's last reported match day revenues were much lower than historically. And you can see that that blanked out 71 million British pounds on the right-hand side of the screen is effectively match day revenue that they have lost out on over the last couple of seasons due to not allowing fans in the stadium. Then, on the other side of the coin, if we look at corporate sponsors and why they would undertake sponsorship, well, it's typically for a few reasons. So if we take Nike, who sponsor Liverpool, for example, really what they are trying to achieve, firstly, is increased brand awareness. Liverpool are a club that are very well known globally admired. They are having great success on the pitch at the moment. And therefore, the likes of Nike and Standard Chartered and other sponsors of Liverpool are trying to leverage the fact that Liverpool is so well known to grow their own brand awareness. Once they grow brand awareness, they are trying to improve brand equity perceptions. So if we go back to that market research I mentioned earlier, because Nike is associating with Liverpool and because corporate brands are associating with very well-known football clubs, they are trying to improve the brand equity perceptions of their own brands. They're trying to be seen as more successful brands. They're trying to be seen in a better perception according to football fans. That then in turn leads to higher merchandise sales. So because, say, for example, people like Liverpool Football Club, that then rubs off on Nike. Now people like Nike, and therefore Nike can start selling and merchandising more of their products and services. They can also leverage things like corporate hospitality. So again, Nike, for example, will have corporate hospitality in Anfield Stadium. They can take their suppliers there, their other kind of stakeholders, government regulators, try and kind of impress them with the fact that they have access to Liverpool, try and improve those terms that they do business with those suppliers with, for example. This also allows them to do targeted marketing. So you'll see many Nike adverts on display, particularly on the signage boards on the side of the football fields. You'll see them behind things like press conferences and player interviews. And you'll see multiple kind of billboards and television marketing leveraging the association between Nike and Liverpool. This can then be measured in terms of stronger return on investments for Nike. So, Nike pay Liverpool around 40 million a year to be their kit manufacturer. However, Nike doesn't do that for free. They are hoping to generate more sales of their own products and services, of their shoes, of their training tops, of their leisure wear kit. And they are hoping that that would generate returns far higher than they are actually willing to pay Liverpool on an annual basis to be their kit manufacturer or sponsor. And that, of course, also leads to greater community goodwill, particularly for the Nike brand around, say, Liverpool in this particular example. And that, again, leads to a virtuous cycle of improving brand awareness. So bottom line is, sponsorship is not really done for the sake of sponsorship. It's really being done to fundamentally make money for not just Liverpool, but Nike in turn. And, you know, what we see at Brand Finance is really the best sponsorships are generating great return on investment for both the club and the sponsor brand in question. So the real question here is, how do corporate sponsors, these sponsor brands like Nike or Standard Chartered or any other sponsor brand you can think of, how do they benefit from sports and associating themselves with these well-known football clubs? So really what they're trying to do, if you remember from the previous slide, is increase brand awareness, but also improve overall perceptions of their brand. So this is an example of a project that we worked on recently at Brand Finance. And what you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here is various brand image perceptions for the specific corporate brand in question. So you can see are more trustworthy than others, actively involved in community, easy to deal with, excellent at what they do. And the difference between the two lines here, the green line and the blue line, are those who are aware of the corporate sponsorship versus those who are not aware. And what you can see here in the blue line is those people who have been exposed to this specific corporate sponsorship in question. For example, those people that know that Nike sponsor Liverpool, they perceive Nike in a much more favorable light, or they perceive this specific brand in question in a much more favorable light. So you can see how the blue line is on the outside of the green line in all of these metrics. What we at Brand Finance can then do is translate the more favorable brand equity perceptions among these football fans into a business case for the return on investment of the sponsorship in question. So in this particular case, what we were looking at was whether a corporate brand should stop or continuing sponsor a Premier League football club. And what we could measure was, because this particular brand was sponsoring this football club, they gained an extra 276 million in overall brand value for their brand based on the brand effects of the sponsorship. So based on the effects that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here. They also had additional business effects. So because this brand in question was sponsoring a Premier League team, they were getting directly more customers, they were acquiring more customers, they were retaining more customers, and they were charging their customers a higher price premium because of those associated brand equity metrics. And through those business effects, that increase in revenue, they increased their brand value by 987 million. And therefore, our recommendation was to maintain the sponsorship, because what that led to was a higher brand value and a higher business value for this corporate sponsor in question. So how do we value these football brands? And I kind of mentioned the technique already, being royalty relief methodology, but we are going to dive a little bit deeper into exactly how we do this from a football perspective. You'll recall this 4-step process where we measure the strength of the brand. And in the football case, we do this using football fan market research. We then determine the appropriate licensing fee for the football brand in question. We apply that to the net forecasted revenues for the brand, and we discount it to the present value, and that is what we call the brand valuation. And what I have on screen here is a graphic of the evolution of football brand valuations since 2016. So there are a couple of things worth noting here. So you'll see that in 2006, Real Madrid were top of the table. And they maintained that for a little while before being overtaken by Manchester United. However, we have seen quite a big change since 2006 to now, where we are in our 17th iteration of our most valuable football brand rankings. Initially, there were only 3 Italian clubs in the top 10, but by 2014, their growth couldn't keep up with the likes of the Premier League, La Liga, and Bundesliga, and all had dropped out. 2010 was also the year that Paris Saint-Germain broke into the ranking for the first time. What we can also see is that 5 Premier League clubs have remained in the league rankings in the top 10 for the whole time since 2006. And also quite interestingly, the total value of the top 10 in 2022 is nearly 8 times the value that the ranking was in 2006. And really, there are a few reasons for this. The first is that since 2006, we have seen a huge increase in broadcasting contracts to watch these football leagues. We've also seen much more lucrative sponsorship deals. So corporate brands are willing to pay much higher fees in order to sponsor these very well-known and very loved football brands. And what we can also see, though, is a kind of solidification of these top 10 football brands, particularly in the way that they are admired and the overall perceptions of football fans around the world. And again, this comes back to that virtuous cycle where because these brands are admired and loved, they can attract and retain better corporate sponsorship deals, they can attract and retain better broadcasting deals, and then reinvest that money back into their football teams to have greater success on the pitch. So here we have effectively the same information from the previous chart, but I've graphed it for you in a line graph since 2012. The average brand value per top 50 team in 2012 was only 179 million euros. In 2022, that value has grown to over 400 million euros. So a huge growth in average brand value among the top 50. And part of the reason for that growth is the popularity of European football. And part of the reason that European football is so popular is because of how competitive it actually is. It's very difficult to try and determine who is going to win any of these given leagues in any given year. And although we've seen huge growth over the last decade, you can see the trend line exhibited on the screen here since 2012, that all of these brands have grown significantly since 2012. What you can see is that in 2020 and 2021, we saw quite a large decline in overall brand value for some of these clubs. And in fact, 6 of these clubs declined in brand value over that period. And again, that was largely due to the impact of not having fans in your stadiums, for example. So a huge decline in matchday revenue. We know that broadcasting and sponsorship deals were impacted, and some sponsors were pulling out of their football clubs or wanting reimbursement for some of their annual sponsorship fees. However, what we can see is between 2021 and 2022, all of those clubs have recovered strongly and increased their brand value again. So now, if we zoom out a little further and we look at 2022's top 50, you can see that we've got Real Madrid and Manchester City on the far left-hand side of the screen. They both have over 1.3 billion in valuation in terms of their overall brand value. And they are 14 times more valuable than the 50th place team, which is Fiorentina on the far right-hand side in the little blue graph there. Real Madrid and Barcelona are between 2.5 times and 3 times more valuable than the next Spanish brand, Atletico. However, it could be interesting to see how Barcelona's widely reported on and off-field troubles impact brand value when we do these rankings again in 2023. We all know they haven't been performing that well on the pitch, and they've had quite a few financial troubles over the last few seasons. The Premier League and the Bundesliga dominate the top 50 by number of brands. So you can see on the bottom of the screen here, we've got the Premier League accounting for 17 places in the top 50. The Bundesliga accounts for 11, the La Liga for 8, League 1, 3, Serie A 7, and then other leagues 4. And you can see that these 4 spots made up of other leagues are made up of Ajax, Celtic, Benfica, and Flamenco. And you can see that they are denoted in grey on screen here. So Ajax is in the middle there, and you can see Celtic, Benfica, and Flamenco on the far right-hand side. Another couple of interesting stats is that the Premier League is well ahead in terms of total brand value contribution in the top 50. So you can see it's nearly 8.5 billion in brand value is accounted for by the Premier League, by those 17 clubs. And again, it's not only due to the fact that they do have the greatest number of brands, but it's also because the Premier League's big 6, so Manchester City, Liverpool, Manchester United, Tottenham Hotspur, Chelsea, Arsenal, they all feature within the top 10 most valuable brands. And that top 10 makes up 58% of total value of the top 50. So really, you can see a massive skew in value as exhibited on this chart, where the top 10 most valuable clubs really bring the most value to the table. Now, I've mentioned brand strength, and here we're going to examine as why brand strength is so important. So you can see we've got overall brand strength as a score out of 100 on the x-axis on screen here. And on the y-axis, we've got overall brand value. And you can see we've just plotted some of the top 50 clubs here. And what you can see immediately is that there is a high correlation between the overall strength of the brand and the overall value of the brand. The correlation suggests that if we took a brand sitting on 72 out of 100, so you can see in the middle of the screen there, and if they were to pull their brand strength up to 80 out of 100, it would likely see a doubling in its brand value. So they would go from a brand value of 200 to a brand value of 400 if they increase their brand strength by 8 points. And we'll see in the next section how a club's brand strength can create this outsized effect on its overall brand value. So here we have some financial insights from the study. And again, if we examine these 3 core revenue streams, and just to remind you again, matchday revenue is from selling tickets and merchandising at the ground, so things like drinks and food and ticket sales. Broadcasting, again, typically negotiated across leagues or competitions. This refers to typically TV broadcasting, so with the likes of BN or Sky, for example. And then finally, commercial revenue. And this is largely referring to merchandising or sponsorship agreements. And again, I've mentioned this slightly earlier, but if we examine them again, we look at the likes of Real Madrid and Man City. You can see how their commercial revenue and their broadcasting revenue really dominate the proportion of their overall revenue makeup. And the top 10 most valuable club brands do in fact have wide varying profiles in terms of their revenue generation. A couple of kind of immediate points to draw your attention to. If you look in the middle of the chart, you look at the likes of Bayern Munich and you look at the likes of PSG. They've got a huge amounts of commercial revenue relative to their overall revenue, but much, much lower broadcasting revenue and much lower matchday revenue. So the likes of Real Madrid and Man City are in fact the highest earners in terms of overall revenue generation among all football clubs. What I've got on screen here is the top 50 football clubs plotted. And on the x-axis, this time we've got brand value rank. So from left to right, 1 to 50. On the y-axis, we've got percentage of total revenue from commercial revenue. And again, you'll remember the graph before where you saw PSG and Bayern Munich having the highest proportion of commercial revenue. So effectively, they are outperforming in terms of their commercial revenue generation. But if I take the same data and I highlight only Premier League clubs, so the clubs in blue now are only Premier League clubs versus, say, the whole sample in red. What you can see here is that Premier League clubs in blue fall below the trend line from the previous graph. So there's a smaller proportion of their revenue coming from sponsors and brand partners. Now, this could mean a few things. So the low proportion is partially a result of the fact that the Premier League has exceptional broadcasting revenues. So the Premier League as a whole negotiate much higher broadcasting revenues than all other football leagues. They also have a more equitable distribution of their broadcasting revenue. So they negotiate much higher broadcasting revenue deals, and they then distribute that money more evenly throughout all teams involved in the Premier League. This is more so than the likes of La Liga, who disproportionately give more revenue from broadcasting to Barcelona and Real Madrid. And perhaps that is why the Premier League is slightly more competitive than La Liga, at least according to our research in terms of overall perceptions. So now I've given an insight as to what it is we measure. But again, just to remind you, how is this helpful and how can clubs work to improve their own fortunes? So here we have a somewhat simplified virtuous cycle of the whole ecosystem between clubs and commercial sponsors, for example. So the first step is to have a strong team and strong facilities, of course. And again, the idea here is that strong facilities, strong team, strong investment into the club, for example, purchasing better players, this should lead to hypothetically better on-pitch performances. Now, of course, better on-pitch performances builds overall strength of the brand. It improves perceptions of the clubs among stakeholders like fans. Of course, if you have higher brand strength and better perceptions, this leads to attracting better sponsorship deals, so more commercial income. You can then take that commercial income and reinvest it straight back into the team by buying better players in the world, for example, or investing more thoroughly in your youth academy. So if we take PSG, I think PSG is a great example here, and it does show exactly how the cycle can be built or broken from all access points that I've mentioned. Now, PSG did originally have a fairly strong brand, which attracted Qatari ownership and sponsorship investment in 2014. This then helped the club build the team, which delivered consistent domestic results, as seen in this chart of league position. So you can see much higher commercial revenue growth in the bottom left, much higher revenues, much higher squad worth in the top left-hand side. That then lead to much better league position. So you can see, consistently being first or second in League One. That in turn leads to a much higher brand strength. And of course, that then leads to the ability to command better commercial revenues once again, and the cycle continues. If we look at how PSG have performed, taking all these factors into account in our overall study, you can see that in terms of their brand value, since 2014, when they were acquired by Qatari ownership and had much more investment, they were valued at 298 million euros. You can see they've grown steadily year on year to the point of the latest ranking, where it's the most valuable they've ever been at 1.2 billion euros. And you can see in the red, this is their overall brand value rank in our tables. So in 2012, they were a low of 38th. Now we can see that they are strongly competing within the top 10, maintaining their position of 7th. And I'm sure, of course, if they manage to secure some European silverware, particularly in the Champions League in the near future, you'll see that rank improve year on year. Again, how is this information used? So we're going to look at kind of a few areas. Well, ultimately, understanding the value of your brand and why your particular football brand is strong, or potentially why or where it's weak, that'll allow you to sell sponsorships. So again, increase that commercial revenue that then you can reinvest back into strengthening your squad and strengthening your team. It allows you to create more targeted partnership activations, so you can be very, very specific around how you try and attempt to grow your brand. You can track the impact of brand and corporate decisions, so perhaps where you should be investing into marketing expenditure a bit more, which countries, which segments, for example. You can evaluate the commercial impact of trophies or big player moves. So obviously there was huge speculation, for example, on the impact on the Barcelona brand of Messi moving to PSG. And of course, we've seen kind of an on-field impact, but no doubt there were off-field impacts too, things like shirt sales, things like attracting and retaining sponsors, for example. You can also react to issues around reputational damages. So things like the European Super League that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, how that impacted those kind of 12 clubs that were trying to break away to form their own European Super League. That can all be measured through the lens of brand valuation and sponsorship valuation. Brand finance, we do offer a whole kind of wide range of these sports services, everything from football fan research to brand evaluation that I've mentioned. We've mentioned competitor and peer benchmarking using the brand strength index. We've mentioned brand strategy and positioning, how to attract sponsors, perhaps from a football club perspective. I've shown you how to determine overall brand and business valuation. We do a lot of work in partnership tracking, so particularly around sponsorships. How is brand equity shifting in a club? How is it shifting in a corporate sponsor? We look at sponsorship activation and strategy and sponsorship return on investment, as well as creating sponsorship prospectus, so trying to find corporate sponsors for these football clubs. And what I thought I would do was show you a few examples of kind of how this is done. Many of you will be familiar with Emirates and the fact that they sponsor multiple football clubs across the globe in some shape or form. In fact, they not only sponsor multiple football clubs, but they're involved in multiple sports, things like golf, rugby, a whole bunch of other sports too. In the football space anyway, you might be familiar with the fact that they sponsor AC Milan, Arsenal, Real Madrid, the FA Cup in England, the Asian Football Confederation, they sponsor Benfica. And what I wanted to show you here is this graph on the right-hand side where we are showing overall brand consideration for the Emirates brand. Now, what is brand consideration? Well, brand consideration is a research metric. So I remember showing you the slides earlier, showing the market research. And really what we ask people is, would you consider flying with Emirates versus, say, one of their competitors? And what we can do then is measure overall consideration among football fans versus non-football fans, or among those aware that Emirates sponsor these football clubs versus those who are not aware. And that's exactly what we've plotted on this graph here. So from left to right, you can see the likes of Portugal, Indonesia, all the way to the other side of the graph, China, Vietnam, and Japan. And the green arrow represents brand consideration for Emirates among football fans. And the red represents brand consideration for Emirates among non-fans. So what you can see here is that all those who can accurately recall that Emirates are involved in sponsorship in football have much higher consideration to fly with Emirates than those who are not aware of their sponsorships or cannot recall them or are non-football fans. So it's a really interesting finding from our perspective. Another example I wanted to show you is that of Petronas. Petronas are an energy company. They operate mainly in the eastern half of the world. And Petronas has been the title sponsor of Mercedes-AMG Motorsport since the German manufacturer returned to the F1 in 2010. So if any of you are interested in F1, you'll know that Petronas are kind of one of the primary sponsors and the name sponsor for Mercedes. And what I wanted to show you was returns generated by Petronas since inception or since commencement of their Mercedes F1 sponsorship. So what we have on this chart is we've got overall brand strength in the green line graph out of 100. In the blue, we've got overall Petronas brand value. And in the red, we've got overall uplift in brand value for Petronas because of their sponsorship in F1. So the red represents positive increase in brand value because of their F1 impact. And what you can see here is the value of the Petronas brand has seen substantial growth of 16% annually between 2010 and 2020, which coincides with their corporate partnership with the Mercedes F1 team. So really excellent, strong growth in brand value as a direct result of corporate sponsorship of Mercedes. You can also see that the brand strength in that little green graph, that green line chart, has grown by 19 points since 2012. So it's grown immensely from 67, a low of 67, around about to when they commenced the partnership in 2011, 2012, to the current highs of today at 86. The partnership has contributed approximately $500 million per annum to Petronas's brand value. So it's been really successful from a brand value growth perspective. And Petronas has activated the partnership effectively. So their lubricants business has increased their market share from 15th in Europe to ranked 10th between 2015 and 2017. And they've got a target to be a top 5 in terms of market share by 2025. So you can see that the F1 partnership with Mercedes has been really lucrative and really successful for the Petronas brand. Other areas where we do quite a lot of work is trying to determine which industries generate the most returns in corporate sponsorships. So again, we're taking our football research here. And what we've done is divide our sponsorships into 3 different types. The first on the left-hand side is the primary shirt sponsor. So that's the front of sleeve sponsor. The second is in the red in the middle. That is the sleeve sponsor. And the third is on the right. That is the other sponsor. So typically you get, the official airline or the official vehicle or the official drink, something like that, of that nature. And what you can see on screen here is that if you look at front of shirt sponsors, cars or the automotive industry has seen really good return on investments, where you can see that the average revenue increase for cars involved in front of shirt sponsorship has been 5.8% as a direct result of sponsorship. If you take a look at sleeve sponsors, here insurance brands are far more successful. And if you take a look at other sponsorships, apparel has been the most successful. So, really interesting. And obviously, if I was to own a car brand and looking to go into sponsorship, I'd be wanting to be a front of shirt sponsor. If I was an insurance brand, I'd want to be a sleeve sponsor. And likewise, if I was an apparel brand, I'd want to be another type of sponsor. So where to now for some of these corporate clubs, particularly these football brands? What should parties be engaged in, and in particular, where they see future growth? Well, kind of one area we wanted to look at was how football and sport in general is being consumed across the globe. And what this chart shows, it shows market research perceptions for the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, USA, China, and Brazil. These were all countries within our market research. And what we asked was respondents in these countries relating to the consumption of football, which of these have you done in the last month? That's traditional media, streaming services, watched documentaries or web media, followed the club on social media, followed the player on social media. And there are a couple of interesting takeaways for me on this chart. So you can see that the USA and China on the far right-hand side, they have the lowest traditional football media consumption relative to other countries. So the USA at 36% and China at 37%. Whereas you can see the likes of the UK and Brazil, they are watching a lot of football on TV. Brazil in general appears to consume more football than all the other countries. So you can see on the far right-hand side, they've got very, very high percentages relative to the other countries, particularly for traditional media and streaming. And quite interestingly, you can see that Spain has the highest level of self-reported social media interaction. So you can see, follow the club on social media. 69% of respondents of football fans in Spain said that they follow their own club on social media. So that's really high. Our latest football fan research also revealed very high engagement levels among younger football fans with regards to both playing and watching esports. So esports is really a huge area for growth for football clubs and corporate brands alike. And we see many club teams broadening their brands into the esports space. The likes of Wolverhampton Wanderers, the likes of PSG have very prominent esport teams. And I think, again, another interesting point to note is the fact that the USA and China and Brazil appear to be more engaged in esports than their European counterparts. So you can see played an esports game in the top of the screen, USA 39%, China 40%, Brazil 42%, compared to Germany, Italy, and Spain, which is relatively low, and France, in fact. And if you look at watched an esports tournament, again, you can see USA, China, Brazil, amongst the younger population, tend to score higher than the likes of Spain and France, for example. Again, we asked another question. Would you like your club to have an esports team competing against other top clubs from Europe and other parts of the globe? And which phrase below sums up the best about how you feel about such a move? Again, we've got the same countries, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, USA, China, and Brazil. And what you can see is overwhelmingly a positive response to the thought of your own football team having an esports team. So at the bottom of the chart, you can see it's a fairly good idea. The club should consider it. An excellent idea. The club should do it. Again, you can see China and Brazil much more favorable to the likes of esports in their European counterparts. And this is quite important for football clubs because the likes of USA, China, South America, they've been marked as huge growth potential areas for European football clubs. They're really trying to tap into the growing football fan base, particularly in the likes of the US and China. You might be familiar with this particular case, but this case is where esports was used to boost the effectiveness of a traditional sporting sponsorship really well. English fourth tier team, they are a football club called Stevenage, and I'm sure many of you have never heard of them, and justifiably so. They did a partnership with Burger King where they worked together to create a challenge where players would pick a team for their campaign in FIFA 2019 football video game in manager mode. And this was a creative way to use esports to drive up the popularity of both a corporate partner, but also the club's brand. So I don't know about you, but Stevenage are really an unknown brand, even in the UK. I live in London and I don't know much about Stevenage. But I'd never heard of them until this specific campaign where Stevenage and Burger King blew up on Twitter. People were using a very clever hashtag. They were getting huge amounts of awareness and recognition. And it shows how well partnership and activation, when it's done well, can really tap into an untapped opportunity, in this case, esports, and work as a terrific brand building tool for both parties. So I think Burger King, in fact, won a whole bunch of partnership activation and advertising awards for this. And of course, instead of Burger King paying huge amounts of money to the likes of, say, Real Madrid or Barcelona or Man United or Liverpool to be their front of shirt sponsor, they paid far, far, far less to sponsor an English fourth division team, but got very similar exposure directly through the esports world, particularly through the FIFA 19 video game. So, what are the key recommendations to think about in building successful sports businesses at the moment? Well, firstly, you should be diversifying and broadening your revenue streams. So these football clubs cannot only rely on high broadcasting revenues, for example. They really need to find other ways to tap into new fans and new geographies, tap into new revenue streams. But in doing so, they really need to keep communicating with fans, particularly effective communication. And with the likes of social media at the moment, that's a much easier thing to do than it used to be. For their current partners, i.e. their sponsorship partners, they should ensure you are delivering the best value proposition possible. You should ensure you are aligning your brand goals when choosing a corporate partner. So it's not just about choosing a sponsor who's paying you the most amount of money. You really want to make sure that you align from a brand perspective, that ethically you're aligned, so there are no kind of reputational issues. And finally, you need to determine whether or not you can get more from your current portfolio as a rights holder and track the level of uplift you provide for the potential corporate sponsors. And then, of course, we need to look at the other side of the coin. We need to look at these partner brands and these corporate sponsorship brands. Firstly, it's important to align your brand with a suitable sponsorship property so you can borrow brand equity as well as meet your own corporate goals. Or another way of thinking about this is ensure an appropriate sponsorship fit. Secondly, does the agreement include access to other sponsorship assets? It's crucial to make sure that your brand is getting as much exposure as possible, whether that be on the front of shirt or on interview boards. So it's really important to use as many assets at your disposal as possible. You should explore all activation channels. It's important to do this regularly to activate appropriately, particularly activating through digital channels to reach a much wider audience. And then finally, you want to measure the return on investment of your sponsorship activities and act accordingly. It's important to do this regularly to assess whether a change in any conditions has affected the return on sponsorship it's generating. We, in fact, recommend that for all marketing activities and campaigns, not just sponsorship, needs to be done on an annual or a semi-annual basis, because after all, sports is just part of the entertainment industry and part of a wide tool base that marketers can use in order to reach their global audiences. Finally, before I take any questions, please feel free to take down my email address. If you'd like to follow up with any questions with me directly, I'm more than happy to jump on a call or answer any of your emails as and when they come through. Otherwise, I think now what we'll do is take questions directly through the chat function.
Declan, thank you so much. I mean, wow, a lot of information to digest and very inspiring. And I think it's been very helpful, okay, for all the marketing professionals that we may have in the audience. So we are going to start with the questions, and we are going to see the first one.
Sure. So, Angel's asking, what is the importance of a club going on stock, open or limited, or managing tokens for the valuation? Are these trends or basics? So, Angel, I'm assuming what you mentioned here is going public and listing on a stock exchange, I think. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But really, that's, from our point of view, a financing decision. It's just a means for them to raise capital. If you look at Chelsea, for example, it's very well publicized, kind of the issues with Roman Abramovich and the situation going on in Russia. As part of the agreement, the English government stepped in there and said whoever's purchasing Chelsea has to invest over £1 billion into the club. And of course, that's a private sale, that wasn't listing Chelsea on an open stock exchange. However, listing Chelsea on an open stock exchange may have achieved the same result because, by selling the equity into Chelsea, the owners could then take that investment and reinvest it into the club, buy players, improve their facilities, potentially expand their stadium. So really, in our view, from a branding perspective, there's no importance of listing publicly. It's really just a kind of managerial or a financing decision. Next. Yaquim says, if, as Mandela put it, sport has the power to change the world, why do you think that elite sport combined with business creates economic and social development projects in poor countries? Well, I think it's in the interest of these sporting clubs to create social development projects in poorer countries, because ultimately that is where the untapped fan base is. I mentioned briefly the USA and China as a fan base, but this also applies to, say, poorer economies, the likes of on the African continent. I think the more that you upskill and provide for those economies, the more kind of valuable the consumer base is, and the more these football clubs, and not just football clubs, but sponsor brands, can tap into these untapped markets to generate their own revenues. So, there is an element of, say, using sport to change the world, and sure, there's an altruistic and kind of positive element to it, but I think a lot of it is also grounded in commercial decision, and I think that is wise commercial decision to try and grow your brand in these underdeveloped economies. Sean is asking, is there any possibility that Barcelona fans buy products, contribute commercially with Real Madrid? Well, not directly. So typically from a fan base perspective, as a Barcelona fan, you're only going to buy Barcelona merchandise, right? You're going to buy Barcelona shirts, kind of Barcelona beanies or Barcelona apparel, and that money indirectly goes straight back to Barcelona, the club. However, because of the way that the broadcasting revenues work, if a Barcelona fan is watching Real Madrid play in the Champions League final, you are indirectly contributing to money that will be going to Real Madrid, because they will be getting money from broadcasting revenue streams as a result of, say, being in the Champions League final. So UEFA would be paying them a certain amount of that broadcasting. So in short, yes, indirectly, but not directly. Sergio is asking, are women's sports measured with the same parameters? What main differences should a corporate sponsor have in mind when investing in women's sports? So this is a very good question. And I'd say there's kind of two aspects to it. So the first aspect is that ultimately sponsors are sponsoring a team because they want to increase overall awareness for their products and services. Now, it's no secret that the women's game, if you take women's football, is not quite as popular as the men's game. So it doesn't get as many consumers viewing the sport. Therefore, as a sponsor in that area, you don't get as many eyeballs exposed to your products and services, on the front shirt of Barcelona or the front shirt of Real Madrid, for example. However, the other aspect that is quite important, I think, particularly in kind of the modern world that we live in, is that brands typically now have to align with a purpose. They have to associate their identity with a purpose, with appropriate corporate social responsibility activations, for example. And I think women's sport is a really good way to do that, particularly speaking to, say, equality in the workplace. So there's kind of, two aspects that you need to balance, but equally, women's sport could definitely generate positive returns for corporate sponsors. Fernando's asking, to what extent can clubs, football players' behavior affect the brand valuation and reputation? Is that taken into account in brand's measurement? It's a very good question. Again, I think there's an indirect impact here. So often what you find is that in legal contracts between players, clubs, and sponsors, there are clauses in there around potential reputational damage and reputational impacts. An example that I can think of that happened this season was the Manchester United player. I've actually just gone blank on his name. Hold on, it'll come to me. Oh, Mason Greenwood. Mason Greenwood, it was well publicized for his kind of horrendous behavior, the way he was treating women, and naturally all of his sponsors dropped him. But there was quite a bad negative pushback on Manchester United and the Manchester United brand because they received such bad publicity, on social media and on the news. There were rumors circulating that they weren't going to drop him. There were rumors circulating that he was training with them again. So, of course, if it's not handled appropriately, then it can definitely affect the brand valuation and reputation of a club.
I think that's all the questions that we have been receiving. Well, they have also your email address in case anyone wants to ask more specifically on something. So Declan, thank you so much. I mean, it's been a pleasure having you today with us. And well, we hope to get inspired by you any other time with any other subject. So we hope to see you again soon. And to the audience, just keep following the channels because the June dates for the next IAA Mondays are going to be released pretty soon because we have some dates changing. So just follow us to know the next IAA Mondays. Okay, and have a nice week and enjoy the rest of the day.
Perfect. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.